The sun was merciless that afternoon, a white, blinding eye over a town that seemed to have forgotten mercy altogether. The air itself felt heavy, full of grit and the sour tang of sweat. Horses shifted in the heat, restless. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then went quiet, as if even it knew what was about to happen wasn't right. They had her standing on a wooden crate in the center of the square. Barefoot. Wrists bound in iron. Her dark hair clung to her face in tangled strands, yet nothing about her posture suggested defeat. She stood tall, proud even, her chin lifted just enough to look the crowd in the eye. You could feel the quiet anger in her, the kind that doesn't shout, only burns. Men leaned against posts and wagons, whispering among themselves. Some smirked. Some stared too long. To them, she was an object, a prize, a punishment, a curiosity. But to him, the young cowboy standing near the edge of the crowd, she didn't look like a captive. She looked like the only person there who still remembered what dignity was. He didn't know why he'd stopped in that town. Just passing through, he'd told himself. But when he saw her, it felt like time stopped moving. The auctioneer's voice cut through the noise, loud and sharp as a whip, an Apache woman, strong, able, sold to the highest bidder. The crowd stirred. Coins clinked. Laughter followed. The cowboy felt his stomach turn. He'd seen ugly things in the frontier, but this felt worse. Maybe it was her silence. She didn't cry or plead. She didn't look broken. Just, waiting. Watching. And when her eyes found his, something in him shifted. They weren't begging eyes. They were challenging ones, asking him silently if he was any different from the others. He tried to look away but couldn't. The wind picked up, carrying a swirl of dust between them. For a brief moment, it felt like they were the only two people there. The auctioneer kept shouting, the bids kept climbing, but all he could hear was the thud of his own heartbeat. They said she was a prisoner, his voice would later say, soft and reflective. But I swear, she looked freer than anyone standing there. Someone near him made a cruel joke about taming wild things. Laughter rippled through the crowd. He clenched his jaw, knuckles widening around the brim of his hat. That's when he realized, it wasn't pity he felt. It was anger. And something else he couldn't name yet. She turned her face slightly then, as if sensing his unrest. Her expression didn't change, but her gaze softened, not with fear, but with recognition. Like she saw in him the flicker of someone who might still remember what it meant to be human. The auctioneer shouted again, going once. And just like that, the story began. The heat hung thick in the air, and yet he felt a chill crawl down his back as the bidding began. Voices rose, harsh, careless, full of amusement. It wasn't a market, it was a spectacle. The sound of silver coins clinking into rough palms mixed with jeers from men who treated another human being as though she were livestock. He stood there, hat low over his eyes, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He told himself not to get involved. It wasn't his business. But his gaze betrayed him, it kept drifting back to her. The woman on the crate didn't flinch. Didn't cry. Didn't speak. She simply let her eyes roam across the faces before her, searching, judging. When her gaze returned to him, it didn't pass by this time. It lingered. Long enough for him to feel it, that quiet pull, sharp and unsettling, like being seen through completely. The auctioneer called out another number. Someone laughed. Another shouted. The air reeked of greed and sweat. And then, through the chaos, he heard the faintest sound, a soft chime of metal against wood as the woman shifted her wrists, making her chains stir. She leaned forward just slightly, and for a moment the crowd's noise dimmed in his ears. He saw her lips move first. Barely. A whisper that seemed too fragile to carry through the noise, yet somehow, it reached him clear as if the world had gone silent for her words alone. Please, buy me, and make me your wife. His breath caught. The world around him froze. For a second, he thought he'd imagined it, a trick of heat and guilt. But then her eyes, fierce and steady, confirmed she had spoken. Not with pleading desperation, but with something else, something that held both strength and sorrow. He didn't hear mockery in her tone. He heard purpose. Strategy. Maybe even faith. She looked at him as if she already knew what kind of man he was, or what kind of man he could be, if he chose to act. Her words weren't a surrender, they were a challenge. It wasn't what she said that broke me, his voice would later recall. It was how her eyes begged for dignity, not rescue. His heart hammered. Around him, the world roared again, numbers shouted, laughter breaking through, but he couldn't hear any of it. All he could see was the fire in her gaze, the small tremor of her breath, the defiance in the way she stood even as the chain pulled at her wrists. He took a step forward, then stopped. Every reason to walk away shouted inside him. But that whisper, those 5 impossible words, had already taken root somewhere deep. He didn't yet understand why she said them. But he knew one thing, he couldn't let anyone else claim her. The bidding rose like a storm, numbers hurled through the air, each one a slap against his conscience. $20. 25. Laughter followed each shout, rough and careless. The cowboy stood still, jaw tight, his heart pounding in time with the thud of the auctioneer's mallet. He could have turned away. He should have. That was what the sensible man in him whispered. But sense had left him the moment she spoke those words. Buy me, and make me your wife. They weren't words of weakness, they were armor. She had offered him a way to save her without stripping away her pride. She wasn't asking for pity. She was daring him to choose, not to be her savior, but to be the kind of man who wouldn't let cruelty stand. The auctioneer's voice snapped him back. $30. 35. The cowboy's hand moved before his mind caught up. 50, he said, steady and clear. The square fell silent for a heartbeat. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. 50. The auctioneer blinked, half amused, half incredulous. $50. Well now, that's a generous price for a wild thing. A few men laughed, sharp, mocking laughter that burned in his ears. One of them spat near his boots. You planning to civilize her, boy? He ignored them. He kept his gaze on her. She didn't move. Didn't speak. But her eyes softened, not with gratitude, but with understanding. She knew what that bid meant. Not just money. Reputation. Judgment. He had stepped out of the line that divided good men from fools, and she could see it. Sold. The mallet struck the block. The word cracked the air like thunder. He felt it in his chest. When he stepped forward, the guard holding her chain smirked, tossing the key toward him. She's all yours, cowboy. The metal felt cold and heavy in his palm. He looked at it for a long moment, that small piece of iron that had dictated her worth in the eyes of the town. Then he knelt, sliding the key into the lock. The click was small, almost inaudible, but it sounded like thunder in his head. She drew her wrists back slowly, rubbing at the red marks the shackles left behind. He didn't reach out to touch her. He only looked, meeting her gaze, uncertain, humbled. When the chain hit the ground, his voice would say softly, I realized I hadn't bought a woman. I'd bought my own test of heart. Someone jeered behind him. Another whistled. He didn't respond. The woman looked down at the broken chain, then back at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind carried dust between them, swirling like a quiet promise that nothing about this act would be simple. And yet, for the first time, he saw her smile. Small. Defiant. Alive. The desert stretched endless under a violet sky, the kind that seemed to hum with silence after sundown. He'd ridden them far from town before stopping, far enough that the laughter of the auction crowd was nothing but a memory carried off by wind and time. They made camp near a dry riverbed. The cowboy worked in silence, gathering brushwood, striking flint, his movements rough from habit but careful now, careful not to startle her. She stayed close but apart, sitting on a fallen log, her posture straight, her face unreadable in the growing dusk. The first spark caught, then the fire bloomed, small at first, then steady, filling the cold air with its amber glow. He glanced at her through the flicker. The light touched her skin like liquid gold. Her hair glistened where strands caught the flame's reflection. There was strength in her stillness, a kind of quiet authority that made him feel like a guest in his own camp. He ladled beans into a tin bowl, sliding it toward her without a word. She hesitated, then accepted. Her hands were rough, marked by rope and struggle, yet she moved with grace, deliberate, measured. She ate slowly, eyes never leaving him. Not suspiciously. Just studying him, as if weighing whether the man who freed her today would still be the same come morning. The only sounds were the fire crackling and the low sigh of wind across the sand. He cleared his throat once, trying to say something, anything, but words felt too clumsy in that silence. She spoke first, in English, halting but clear. Why? He looked up. Why what? Why did you buy me? He stared into the flames. Because it was wrong, what they were doing. She tilted her head, her expression softening just a little. Many men see wrong things. Few stop them. He swallowed. I couldn't walk away. A pause, then, the faintest smile touched her lips. Then maybe, you are not like them. Her voice was low, almost kind. He felt something stir in him, not pride, but something gentler. Respect. Connection. They sat like that for a long time, saying little. Every now and then, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. Her hair brushed across her shoulder, she tucked it back behind her ear, and his eyes followed the movement without meaning to. When she looked at him again, her gaze held a question he couldn't yet answer. It wasn't about ownership or rescue, it was about trust. He laid his coat near the fire and gestured lightly toward it. It'll get cold tonight. You can use this. She hesitated, then nodded once. When she reached for it, their hands brushed, brief, accidental, electric. Neither spoke. But in that quiet touch, the desert itself seemed to pause, as if it knew something fragile had just begun. Every time she looked at me, his voice would later recall, I felt the world go quiet, like even the stars were listening. The dawn came slow, soft light spilling across the desert like it was afraid to wake them. He was already up, tending the fire, while she sat wrapped in his coat, watching the first rays turn the sand from gray to gold. They hadn't spoken much through the night. A few words, a few quiet exchanges of glance and gesture. But something had changed, a weight had lifted between them. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt shared. When he poured water into a small tin cup and handed it to her, she accepted it without hesitation. That was new. He sat across from her, careful to keep space between them, though every part of him wanted to move closer, not out of desire, but out of something softer, something protective. For a while, neither spoke. The desert around them began to stir, a hawk circling overhead, the faint rustle of wind through dry grass. Then she broke the silence. My people used to call this place home, she said quietly, her accent wrapping around the English words with a rhythm that sounded almost like music. Now it's only bones and ghosts. He didn't interrupt. She looked down at her hands, at the faint scars circling her wrists. They came one night. Soldiers. I ran with my sister. She fell. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. She didn't cry, but he could feel the weight of the memory in every syllable. I was taken. Sold. Passed from one hand to another. He stared at the ground, jaw tight. I'm sorry, he said softly. She shook her head. Sorry doesn't change what's gone. Her eyes lifted to meet his. But choice does. That word, choice, hit him like an arrow. She leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but edged with quiet power. That is why I said those words to you. Buy me, and make me your wife. He blinked, uncertain how to respond. I needed one man, not a kind man, just a man with eyes still open, to see me as human. To take me away from them. To let me choose what happens next. Her gaze was steady, piercing, but there was a tremor in it too. I did not mean to shame you. I meant to survive. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. You don't have to explain. I do, she said gently. Because you are the first who listened. For a long time, they sat in silence again. Then, with hesitant grace, she reached out and turned her wrist upward, showing the faint white line where the chain had bitten deep. You see this? She said. It will fade. But not go away. That is how I remember who I was. He looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. And who you are now. Her lips curved into the smallest, softest smile. Free. For now. She wasn't broken, his voice would later say. She was just tired of being misunderstood. By late afternoon, the horizon turned gray, clouds rolling in from the west like an advancing army. The wind picked up, stirring sand into ghostly trails behind their horses. The air smelled of rain, sharp and metallic. They rode until the first drops fell. Fat, heavy ones that hit the dust and vanished in seconds. Then came more, steady, relentless, until the desert itself seemed to breathe again after months of thirst. He spotted a small ledge under a rocky overhang and guided the horses there. She followed without a word, her hair already damp, sticking to her cheeks. When they dismounted, the storm broke open, rain pelting down in sheets, drumming against stone, drowning out every other sound. They crouched beneath the shelter, close but not touching. The space was small, forcing them nearer than either intended. The air grew cool, laced with the scent of wet earth and sage. He shrugged off his coat and held it out. You'll freeze if you don't take it. She hesitated. And you? I'll live, he said simply. She took it, slowly, carefully, her fingers brushing his as she did. The touch was brief, but it left his pulse unsteady. She wrapped the coat around herself, her shoulders relaxing as the warmth seeped in. For a while, they just listened to the rain. It hit the ground in a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, the sound filling the silence between them. She glanced sideways, her eyes soft in the dim light. Do you miss it? She asked. He frowned. Miss what? Belonging somewhere. He let out a quiet breath. Used to. Now I think some folks aren't meant to stay put. He turned to her. You. Her smile was faint but real. I belonged once. Maybe I will again. The storm rolled on. A flash of lightning lit the sky, and for an instant her face was silvered, rain glistening on her skin like jewels. She shivered, and without thinking, he moved closer, his arm hovering for a second before settling gently around her shoulders. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him, just enough that he could feel the weight of her head against his chest. He froze, afraid even to breathe too loud. Her hair smelled of smoke and rain. His heartbeat steadied under her ear, and she let out a soft sigh, not of fear, but of peace. I thought I was protecting her, his voice would later confess. But somewhere between the thunder and her heartbeat, I realized she'd saved me too. The storm began to ease, thunder fading into the distance. But they stayed like that long after the rain stopped, neither speaking, neither moving, two souls that had finally stopped running. When she finally lifted her head, their eyes met, no words, no promises. Just an unspoken truth. They weren't strangers anymore. By the time the rain passed, the desert had changed. What had been dry and lifeless now glistened under a pale morning sun. The air felt new, washed clean. Every plant, every stone, seemed alive again, as though the world itself had been reborn overnight. They rode in silence, the horses' hooves soft against the wet ground. Neither spoke much, words felt too small for what the night had given them. But every glance, every quiet breath between them, carried a language of its own, something wordless yet complete. As the day wore on, the terrain shifted. Hills rolled into open plains, and beyond them, the faint shimmer of distant mountains. He knew where they were heading, the border of Apache land. The place she'd once called home. By midday, they stopped near a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Below them, wildflowers had begun to bloom after the storm, red, yellow, and white, scattered across the earth like a promise. She dismounted first, standing at the edge, the wind tugging gently at her hair. He watched her, unsure what to say. Part of him wanted to ask her to stay, another part knew that love meant letting her choose. She turned, eyes bright in the sunlight. "You brought me home," she said softly. He looked away, running a thumb over the worn leather of his gloves. "It's where you belong." For a moment, she didn't reply. Then she stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, the faint trace of a smile that wasn't born from gratitude but from understanding. "I belong where I am free," she said. "And freedom is not a place, it is a person." The words hit him harder than any bullet could. He swallowed, trying to find his voice. "And what if that person is standing right in front of you?" The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full, humming with something alive and real. She reached up slowly, her hand brushing the side of his face, a gesture light as wind, but steady. "Then make me your wife," she whispered, "by choice this time." He didn't move at first. He just looked at her, this woman who had endured pain, loss, and humiliation, yet still stood with her chin high, her spirit unbroken. Then he took her hand, pressing it gently to his chest. This time, his voice would say, soft with awe, she wasn't asking to be owned, she was asking to be chosen. He smiled, small, trembling, but real. "Then I choose you," he whispered. The wind caught her hair as she smiled back, a smile that seemed to warm the air around them. She stepped closer, her forehead resting against his for a heartbeat that lasted forever. No chains. No crowd. No fear. Just two souls who had found home in each other. As the sun rose higher, they turned toward the open horizon, not as captor and captive, not as savior and saved, but as equals walking into whatever life waited beyond the desert. And the wind, carrying the scent of rain and wildflowers, whispered their vow back to the world.